Hello again, 122, to conclude the events of World War II and to begin some of the reasons why Germany lost the war and also the Japanese. We come now to the turning point of the war in 1942-1943. The entry of the United States into the war created a coalition, the Grand Alliance, that ultimately defeated the Axis powers of Germany, Italy, and Japan. The Germans were forced once again to fight a two-front war, and that was something that they were not able to do. And to overcome mutual suspicions, the three major allies, Britain, the United States, and the Soviet Union, agreed to stress military operations while ignoring political differences. At the beginning of 1943, the Allies also agreed to fight until the Axis powers surrendered unconditionally, a decision that had the effect of cementing the Grand Alliance by making it nearly impossible for Hitler to divide his foes. As 1942 began, however, defeat was far from Hitler's mind. As the Japanese forces advanced into the Pacific after crippling the American naval fleet at Pearl Harbor, Hitler continued the war in Europe against Britain and the Soviet Union. Until the fall of 1942, it appeared that the Germans still might prevail on the battlefield. Reinforcements in North Africa enabled the Afrika Korps under General Erwin Rommel to break through the British defenses in Egypt and advance towards Alexandria. But as we mentioned, in the spring of 1942, the Soviet Union was going very well for the Germans also, and they had captured the entire Crimean. But by the fall of 1942, the war had turned against the Germans, because in North Africa, the British forces, as we said, had stopped Rommel at El Alamein in the summer of 42 and then forced them back across the desert. And in November, as we mentioned, they invaded French North Africa and they forced the Germans and Italians to surrender in May of 43. On the Eastern Front, the turning point occurred at Stalingrad. After the capture of the Crimean, Hitler decided that Stalingrad, a major industrial center on the Volga River, should be taken next. And between November 1942 and February 1943, the German troops were stopped, then encircled, and finally forced to surrender on February 2, 1943. And on page 663, there are some excellent excerpts from a German soldier's diary at Stalingrad. And he goes from the euphoria of July and August to the very interesting day after Christmas, what the Germans were down to. The entire German Sixth Army of 300,000 men were lost during this time. And by February of 1943, the German forces in the Soviet Union were back to their positions of the June 1942. This is another reason for the German defeat. The Soviets were able to withstand unbelievable punishment and death and loss of soldiers, and they still overcame this and pushed the Nazis back to where they started. And the tide of the battle in the Far East also turned dramatically in 1942. In the Battle of the Coral Sea, on May 7th through 8th, 1942, the American naval forces stopped the Japanese advance and temporarily relieved Australia of the threat of invasion. Battle of Coral Sea saved Australia. On June the 4th, at the Battle of Midway Island, American carrier planes destroyed all four of the attacking Japanese aircraft carriers and established American naval superiority in the Pacific. The victory came at a high cost. About 2/5 of the American planes were shot down, 40% in the encounter. And by the fall of 1942, Allied forces were beginning to gather for offensive operations in three areas, from bases in North Burma and India into the rest of Burma in the Solomon Islands and on New Guinea, with forces under the direction of American General Douglas MacArthur moving towards the Philippines, and across the Pacific, where combined U.S. Army, Marine, and Navy forces began to mount attacks in a series of leapfrogging campaigns or island-hopping campaigns against Japanese-held islands. They are only taking strategic islands. And after a series of bitter engagements in the waters of the Solomon Islands from August to November 1942, Japanese forces began to fade. And the last years of the war. By the beginning of 1943, the tide of battle had turned against Germany, Italy, and Japan. After Axis forces had surrendered in Tunisia on May 13, 1943, the Allies crossed the Mediterranean and carried the war to Italy. After taking Sicily, Allied troops began the invasion of mainland Italy in September. In the meantime, after the ouster and arrest of Benito Mussolini, a new Italian government offered to surrender to the Allied forces, and Hitler wasn't having any of that. But Mussolini was liberated by the Germans in a daring raid, and then set up as the head of a puppet German state in northern Italy, while German troops marched in and occupied much of Italy. The new defensive lines established by the Germans in the hills, they had the high ground south of Rome, were so effective that the Allied advance up the Italian peninsula was a painstaking affair accompanied by heavy casualties. And Rome did not fall to the Allies until June 4, 1944, just 2 days before D-Day. By that time, the Italian War had assumed a secondary role anyways, as the Allies prepared to open their long-awaited second front in Western Europe. And under the direction of American General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the Allies landed 5 assault divisions, paratrooper divisions, and then on 4 different places at Normandy, at Sword, Juno, Omaha, and Utah beaches on June 6, 1944, in history's greatest naval invasion. An initially indecisive German response enabled the Allied forces to establish a beachhead, and within 3 months they had landed 2 million men and 500,000 vehicles that pushed inland and broke through the German defensive lines. Now the Germans are fighting on 2 fronts, and that's more than they're going to be able to overcome. After the breakout, Allied troops moved south and east under Patton, and they liberated Paris by the end of August. By March 1945, they had crossed the Rhine River and advanced farther into Germany. By the end of April 1945, Allied armies in northern Germany had moved toward the Elbe River, where they finally linked up with the Soviets. And the Soviets had come a long way since the Battle of Stalingrad in 1943. In the summer of 43, they soundly defeated the German forces at the Battle of Kursk from July the 5th through the 12th in the greatest tank battle of World War II. Soviet forces then began a relentless advance westward. The Soviets had reoccupied Ukraine by the end of 1943 and lifted the siege of Leningrad and moved into the Baltic states by the beginning of 1944. Advancing along a northern front, Soviet troops occupied Warsaw and Poland in January of 1945 and entered Berlin in April. Meanwhile, Soviet troops along a southern front had swept through Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria. And everywhere they went, ladies and gentlemen, those Soviet troops will not leave until the early 1990s. In January of 45, Hitler had moved into Bunker 55, 55 feet under Berlin to direct the final stages of the war. And in his final political testament, Hitler, consistent to the end in his rabid anti-Semitism, blamed the Jews for the war. And he committed suicide on April 30th, 2 days after Mussolini had been shot by partisan Italian forces. And on May the 7th, German commanders surrendered, and VE Day, May 8th, signified that the war in Europe was over. Now the defeat of Japan, the war in Asia is still going on. Beginning in 1943, American forces had gone on the offensive and proceeded slowly at times across the Pacific. The Americans took an increasing toll of enemy resources, especially at sea and in the air. And as Allied military power drew inexorably closer to the main Japanese islands in the first months of 1945, and on page 665, Film and History talks about the 2 Clint Eastwood directed movies, Flag of Our Fathers, talks about the Battle of Iwo Jima from an American perspective, and then Letters from Iwo Jima presented the Japanese perspective, and that film won numerous awards, including a nomination for Best Picture. President Harry Truman, who had succeeded to the presidency upon the death of Franklin Roosevelt in April, had an excruciatingly difficult decision to make, because the Battle of Iwo Jima and Okinawa were just heavy fighting and heavy casualties resulted. Should he use the atomic bombs? At the time, only 2 had been developed, and their effectiveness had not been demonstrated to bring the war to an end without the necessity of any further Allied invasion of the Japanese homeland. And as the world knows, Japanese answered yes, or Truman answered yes, because after the Japanese government had decreed the mobilization of all people between the ages of 13 and 60 into the so-called People's Volunteer Corps, President Truman and his advisors decided that Japanese fanaticism might mean 1 million American casualties, and who knows how many Japanese casualties. And Truman answered that question then in the affirmative, and the first bomb was dropped on the city of Hiroshima on August 6th, and 3 days later a second bomb was dropped on Nagasaki, and Japan and the Emperor surrendered unconditionally on August 14th. And World War II then was finally over.